The Nigerian Civil War, often hidden beneath the dust of history, remains one of the darkest and most emotional chapters in Africa's story. It began with hope, pride, and politics, but ended in hunger, ruins, and silence. To understand how a nation tore itself apart, we must return to its roots, long before the first gun was fired. It begins not with the sound of gunfire, but with silence, the kind that carries the weight of centuries. A land rich with rivers, forests, and oil. A land where the Niger and the Benue meet, where hundreds of languages once coexisted without borders. Before the name Nigeria ever existed, these people were many nations, the Igbo in the east, the Hausa and Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and countless others whose names never made it into textbooks. Then came the men with maps. In 1914, the British drew a line across the land, merging the northern and southern protectorates. It was not unity. It was convenience. Two regions that barely understood each other were now told they were one nation. A nation born not from understanding, but from administration. The British ruled through divide and rule. They praised some tribes for obedience, condemned others for rebellion, and left a seed of mistrust that would one day grow into a forest of suspicion. The North was favored with indirect rule, allowing emirs to govern under colonial supervision. The South, especially the East, faced direct British control. Schools, missions, and Western education spread quickly. By independence, the South was more educated, more urban, and more politically conscious. The North, larger and more conservative, feared being dominated by these southern elites. The British left behind this imbalance, and then called it democracy. When independence came in 1960, the air was filled with hope. Crowds danced in the streets of Lagos. Flags waved high. But beneath the music, there was tension. Each region had its own heroes, its own parties, its own ambitions. Sir Ahmadu Bello of the North wanted to protect Islamic tradition. Chief Obafemi Awolowo dreamed of a federal system where each region would grow at its own pace. Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the nationalist from the East, preached unity, but even he knew that unity built on fear was fragile. The new nation walked like a child learning to balance on uneven legs. The oil in the Niger Delta promised wealth. But corruption and competition soon turned politics into warfare without bullets. Elections were rigged. Census results were falsified. The dream of independence began to rot from within. By 1962, regional politics had become a battlefield. The Western region was thrown into crisis. The action group split apart, and riots filled the streets of Ibadan. In the North, the NPC held tightly to power, while Southern voices cried of marginalization. The East watched, cautious, ambitious, and ready. It was only a matter of time before the center could no longer hold. By 1965, the anger of the people had reached its boiling point. Soldiers, once loyal to the idea of the new Nigeria, began to whisper in the barracks. They spoke of corruption, of injustice, of how the politicians had betrayed the promise of independence. In their hearts, they believed they could save the country. They would soon discover how wrong they were. And so, in the cold morning of January 15, 1966, Nigeria would wake up to a sound it had never heard before. Gunfire. The morning of January 15, 1966, was quiet, too quiet. In Lagos, the city still slept under the humid night air. But in the shadows, young soldiers moved like ghosts. They carried rifles, not for parade, but for revolution. Led by Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nziogu, a 29-year-old officer stationed in Kaduna, a group of idealistic soldiers had decided that enough was enough. They said they wanted to save Nigeria from corruption, from tribal politics, from chaos. But what began as a mission to cleanse the nation would soon ignite a fire that no one could control. By dawn, the coup had spread across the country. In Lagos, Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was arrested. In Kaduna, Ahmadu Bello, the revered Sardauna of Sokoto and leader of the northern region, was assassinated in his home. In Ibadan, Chief Samuel Akintola, premier of the western region, was gunned down. The North's political leadership was nearly wiped out in a single night. The plotters believed they were saving Nigeria, but to many, it looked like something else. Most of the officers who led the coup were Igbo, from the east. Most of those killed were northern leaders. To the northern people, this was not a revolution, it was murder. And in that moment, the unity of Nigeria shattered. In Lagos, Major General Johnson Aguiyi Ironsi, the highest-ranking officer in the Nigerian army, moved swiftly to take control. He was also Igbo, a man of discipline and calm authority. He declared himself head of state, suspended the constitution, and promised to restore order. For a moment, the nation breathed again. But beneath the surface, anger boiled. In the north, people whispered that the coup was an Igbo conspiracy. They saw Ironsi's rise to power as proof. Their leaders had been killed, now an Igbo man ruled the country. The fear was not just political, it was personal. Markets, schools, and army barracks filled with suspicion. Brothers who once fought side by side began to look at each other as enemies. Ironsi tried to calm the nation. He promised reconciliation, discipline, and unity. He toured the country, shaking hands with northern emirs, meeting with politicians, and urging forgiveness. But one decision changed everything. On May 24, 1966, Ironsi announced Decree No. 34, abolishing the federal system of government. He called it a unitary decree, a step toward national unity. But to the north, it felt like the final takeover. They feared that the Igbo-dominated East would now control the entire country, its army, its politics, its future. That night, in the north, the streets filled with murmurs. Soldiers whispered of revenge. Civilians began to organize mobs. Every rumor added fuel to the fire. When the first attacks began, they were small, but they spread like dry grass in harmattan wind. Easterners, mostly Igbo traders, teachers, and civil servants, were hunted down in the north. Trains arriving from Kaduna and Kano carried not passengers, but corpses. Bodies lay along the rail lines. Families fled in trucks, buses, and on foot, heading back east, terrified. The promise of one Nigeria was now drowned in blood. By July 29, 1966, the military's patience snapped. Northern officers, furious and grieving, struck back. They called it the counter-coup. General Ironsi was captured while visiting Ibadan, alongside his host, Colonel Adekono Fojuyi, a Yoruba officer who refused to abandon him. Both men were executed by angry soldiers. When the dust settled, a young northern officer emerged as the new leader, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, only 31 years old. He promised peace, forgiveness, and stability. But the killings did not stop. In city after city, Easterners were slaughtered. Their only crime, their tribe. Trains once filled with commerce now carried refugees. In Enugu, Onitsha, and Abia, the roads were crowded with families returning home, carrying only what they could. Children who had grown up in Kaduna and Jos no longer spoke Hausa, they spoke fear. The East became silent, listening, waiting. Its people asked one question. If Nigeria could no longer protect them, did they still belong to Nigeria? And somewhere in Enugu, a man named Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, the military governor of the eastern region, began to believe the answer was no. The rains came in 1966, but they did not wash away the blood. Across the north, the air was heavy with fear and anger. Markets that once echoed with laughter were now silent. The streets smelled of smoke and death. The massacres had begun, not suddenly, but in waves. It started with whispers, they say the Igbo soldiers killed our leaders. Then with shouts, drive them out. Avenge the north. Then, machetes. Guns. Fire. In Kano, Easterners were hunted down in the streets. In Zaria, they were pulled off buses and killed where they stood. In Jos, houses were burned with families inside. In Sokoto, even churches became targets. By the end of that year, over 30,000 Easterners were dead, men, women, children. The Nigerian state watched, powerless or unwilling to stop it. Trains leaving the north were filled not with passengers, but survivors, faces blank with shock. They carried nothing but the memory of what they had seen. Mothers clutched their babies. Fathers carried small bags, too afraid to look back. Every station, every road became a part of exile leading east. In Enugu, Ojukwu received them, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. They arrived by truck, by foot, by train. He saw their wounds, heard their stories. And with each story, the idea of Nigeria grew darker. To many Easterners, the country no longer felt like home. They said, "We cannot live with people who want us dead." Ojukwu listened. He was proud, educated, a soldier of conviction. He wanted peace, but peace seemed impossible. The federal government had failed to protect his people. And now, under Gowon's new regime, trust was gone. Gowon himself was not a cruel man. He was young, soft-spoken, and genuinely believed in keeping Nigeria one. But his government was fragile, surrounded by angry northern officers and desperate politicians. He tried to negotiate with Ojukwu. He called for unity conferences, for peace talks. Yet every meeting ended in deeper mistrust. Then came Aburi, January 1967. In the quiet hills of Ghana, both men met, Gowon and Ojukwu. The air was tense, but for a moment, there was hope. They spoke like brothers who had fought the same war and wanted to avoid another. The agreement they reached seemed simple. Each region would have control over its own affairs. The federal government would be weak, the regions would be strong. It was autonomy, not secession. Ojukwu believed in it. Gowon signed it. For a few days, it seemed the nation might heal. But when Gowon returned to Lagos, the story changed. His advisors, mostly northern officers and civil servants, warned him that Aburi was suicide. They said it would destroy Nigeria's unity. So, he hesitated. Then he reversed it. The Aburi Accord, which could have saved Nigeria, was rejected. To the east, it was a betrayal. In Enugu, Ojukwu called his council together. He read the report of fresh massacres, of trains arriving daily with mutilated bodies. He watched as refugees filled schools, churches, and empty buildings, hungry, broken, and afraid. The East had become a nation of the displaced. One night, he stood before his officers and spoke quietly. "If the rest of Nigeria will not let us leave, then we must live on our own." His words spread like fire through the region. Posters appeared in markets, "We are Biafrans." Men volunteered for the new army. Factories began to produce crude weapons. Artists painted the rising sun red, black, green, and gold. Children learned to sing a new anthem they did not yet understand. In Lagos, Gowon declared new state divisions, breaking Nigeria's 4 regions into 12 states. It was meant to weaken Ojukwu's hold on the East. But instead, it deepened the divide. To Ojukwu, this was an act of war. To his people, it was proof that they were being broken apart deliberately. Then, on May 30, 1967, Ojukwu made the announcement the world had been dreading. He stood before microphones, his uniform pressed, his face calm but determined. And with the voice of a man carrying both pride and sorrow, he declared, "Having mandated me to proclaim on your behalf, and in your name, that Eastern Nigeria be henceforth a sovereign and independent state, now to be known as the Republic of Biafra." The crowd roared. Flags of the rising sun filled the air. Women ululated, men raised their fists, and children danced without knowing what it meant. They believed a new dawn had come, a dawn of safety, dignity, and peace. But beyond their borders, the drums of war had already begun to beat. The morning of July 6, 1967, was heavy with silence. Then, at exactly 5 a.m., the first shell fell. It exploded near Gakom, a small border town between the Midwest and the East. The Nigerian Civil War had begun. The federal forces called it Operation Unicord. Their mission was simple, to crush the secession and bring Biafra back, by force if necessary. The government called it a police action. But in truth, it was a war. A war between brothers who once shared the same flag. The first Nigerian columns moved in from the north and the west. Well-equipped, well-trained, and confident of a swift victory. They believed Biafra would fall in 2 weeks. But the Biafrans, though small in number, were driven by something stronger than weapons. By fear, pride, and the memory of the dead. Their soldiers were young, some barely out of school. They wore mismatched uniforms and carried old rifles. Many repaired with tape and wire. They had no air force, no navy, few vehicles. Yet their courage filled the forest like a storm. In the town of Nsukka, the first clashes erupted. The Nigerian army advanced under Colonel Shua, and the Biafrans fought back fiercely. They ambushed convoys, cut bridges, and vanished into the trees. Each inch of land became a battlefield. Each street, a graveyard. At the same time, Ojukwu sent a desperate message to his people. Defend your homeland with everything you have. Our struggle is for survival, not conquest. Then came a bold move. The Biafrans struck westward, crossing the Niger River into the Midwest region, hoping to take the fight away from their borders. Colonel Victor Banjo, a Yoruba officer loyal to Ojukwu, led the invasion. Their goal, to capture Benin, then move north toward Lagos, forcing Gowon to negotiate. At first, it worked. Biafran troops advanced rapidly, taking Benin City and surprising the Federal Army. For a moment, the world gasped. Could the tiny new republic actually win? But the victory was short-lived. Disorganization, lack of supplies, and mistrust among commanders slowed them down. The people of the Midwest, mostly non-Igbo, were uncertain whom to trust. Biafran propaganda promised liberation, but many saw them as invaders. Then, the federal forces regrouped. They counterattacked under Colonel Matola Mohammed. Young, fearless, and ruthless. By early September 1967, Benin City fell back to the Federal Army. The Biafrans retreated across the Niger in panic and exhaustion. The bridge at Asaba became a trap. Thousands of fleeing civilians tried to cross, men, women, children. When the Nigerian troops entered the town, they accused the people of Asaba of supporting Biafra. Men were separated from the crowd, lined up in the square, and executed in groups. The blood of innocents soaked the streets. Mothers screamed until their voices broke. Historians would later call it the Asaba massacre. When the news reached Enugu, Ojukwu was silent for a long time. Then he said, quietly, "They have shown us what unity means to them." From that day, Biafra's war became more than politics. It became survival. Every home was turned into a workshop. Blacksmiths made bullets from scrap metal. Mechanics built armored cars from abandoned trucks. They called them Ogbunig, the mass killers. Women cooked for soldiers, children carried messages through the forest. The people called it the People's War. Yet hunger had already begun to whisper through the land. Food became scarce. Trade routes were cut off by federal blockades. The cities grew quiet. But in those early months, Biafra still believed. They sang, they prayed. They buried their dead and kept fighting. For them, freedom was worth any price, even if that price was life itself. By late 1967, the rhythm of war had changed. The songs of hope that once echoed across Biafra were replaced by the dull hum of fear. The federal troops advanced from every direction, north, west, and south. Cities that once pulsed with life were turning to shadows of themselves. Enugu, the proud capital of Biafra, was the heart of the young nation. It was where Ojukwu ruled, where foreign journalists gathered, where the dream of independence had first taken voice. But now, the Nigerian army was closing in. Colonel Muhammad Shua's troops moved with brutal precision, shelling villages, cutting off roads, turning the journey to Enugu into a trail of fire and ruin. Ojukwu refused to abandon the city at first. He wanted to stand firm, to show the world that Biafra would not run. But when the artillery shells began to fall on the city itself, he had no choice. In October 1967, Enugu fell. The Nigerian flag was raised over the shattered government house. Reporters filmed soldiers looting the city, while survivors wandered aimlessly among the ruins. To many outside observers, it seemed like the end of Biafra. But it was not the end. The capital moved south, first to Umuahia, then later to Owerri. From hidden radio stations, Biafran voices spoke defiantly to the world. We are still here. The struggle continues. Ojukwu's broadcast became both poetry and plea. He spoke of liberty, of dignity, of the right of a people to exist. Each speech carried pain, the pain of a man watching his nation bleed. Meanwhile, the blockade began to tighten. The Nigerian Navy patrolled the coast. Airstrips were bombed. No food, no medicine, no supplies could enter the east. The world called it a civil war. But for those inside Biafra, it was starvation warfare. Children began to shrink before their mothers' eyes. Their bellies swelled, their limbs grew thin as sticks. Hospitals ran out of medicine, and doctors wept because there was nothing left to give. Even the strongest soldiers trembled at the sight of the dying. The war that had started as a battle for freedom was turning into a slow, endless death for civilians. In Europe and America, the images began to appear on television screens. Tiny children with hollow eyes, lying on mats. Villages turned to graves. The world gasped, but governments hesitated. Some saw Biafra as a moral cause, others saw only political risk. Britain, Nigeria's former colonial master, stood firmly behind Gowon. They provided weapons, funds, and diplomatic cover. The Soviet Union joined them, eager for influence in West Africa. It was a strange alliance. London and Moscow, united in supporting the same war. Biafra found few friends. Only a handful of nations, Côte d'Ivoire, Tanzania, Gabon, and Zambia, recognized it. France offered quiet sympathy. But never enough to turn the tide. Ojukwu's government tried to reach the United Nations. But the world was deaf to their cries. And yet, amid the silence of politics, ordinary people around the globe began to care. Church groups, students, aid workers, they saw the pictures and could not look away. Out of that compassion, a new kind of humanitarian movement was born. French doctors who worked secretly in Biafra would later form Médecins Sans Frontières. Doctors Without Borders. Their mission inspired by what they had seen in the starving land. Inside Biafra, the people held on. They built new airstrips hidden in the forest. Places like Uli, where aid planes landed at night, their lights off. Carrying powdered milk, medicine, and prayers. Pilots called it the Biafran Run. Each flight was a race against death. And still, the war went on. Every night, bombs fell on towns and refugee camps. Every morning, the living buried the dead and began again. The radio continued to play soft music between Ojukwu's speeches. Songs of love and loss, of courage and faith. To the outside world, Biafra seemed doomed. But to those inside, surrender was worse than death. By 1968, Biafra had become a land under siege. Cut off from the world, surrounded by enemies. And starved into submission. But even in that darkness, a strange kind of light began to glow. The light of human resilience. Everywhere in the East, people were inventing new ways to survive. Engineers who once built cars now built weapons. Doctors learned to treat wounds with herbs when medicine ran out. Children carried buckets of water through war zones. Their faces streaked with dust and hope. In the heart of the forest, the Biafran Research and Production Organization, known simply as RAP, was born. It was made up of young scientists, students, and mechanics. Men who refused to give up. They built bombs from scrap metal, refined crude oil into petrol, and designed rockets and armored vehicles from abandoned parts. Their most feared creation was the Ogbunig, a homemade landmine whose explosion could level entire trucks. It became the symbol of Biafran ingenuity. Proof that the human spirit could fight even when cornered. Meanwhile, the hunger deepened. Fields once rich with cassava and yam now lay empty. Farmers could not plant, soldiers needed every hand at the front. The blockade made sure no food entered. People ate lizards, grass, and soup made from tree bark. In some villages, a single cup of rice was shared by 10. The children suffered the most. They were called the Kwashiorkor children. Their hair turned orange. Their eyes too large for their faces. Their voices no louder than a whisper. They no longer cried, they had no energy left to. Yet even amid this horror, faith endured. Church bells rang through ruined towns. Pastors prayed over the dying, asking God not for victory, but for mercy. Women sang softly at night, their lullabies drifting through the darkness like broken wings. They sang not just for their children, but for a nation they refused to let die. In the camps, aid workers from all over the world risked their lives to help. The Red Cross, Caritas, and small Christian charities organized daring night flights. Their planes came in silence, landing on the secret airstrip at Uli. A narrow strip of light cut into the jungle, invisible from the sky. They brought powdered milk, medicine, and hope. But for every plane that landed, 10 others were stopped by the Nigerian blockade. The world was watching, but most looked away. In London, officials said, "We must not interfere in Nigeria's internal affairs." In Moscow, it was called a domestic problem. Even the United States hesitated, unwilling to anger an oil-rich ally. So the war continued. A slow war, where starvation became the deadliest weapon of all. Ojukwu's radio voice still reached his people. Calm, proud, unwavering. He told them, "We shall survive. We shall endure until freedom is ours." But inside his heart, he knew time was running out. The Biafran army was shrinking. Weapons were scarce, food scarcer still. Many soldiers fought barefoot, carrying rifles older than themselves. Yet they fought on, ambushing convoys, defending villages, retreating, and rising again. And through all this, the idea of Biafra refused to die. To outsiders, it was a lost cause. To its people, it was a promise. A promise that they were human, that their suffering meant something. In the midst of famine, people still whispered, "When the sun rises, Biafra lives." That rising sun, painted on their flag, was no longer just a symbol of independence. It was a prayer. A prayer that the world might one day remember. That a small people once stood alone against the impossible, and still refused to disappear. By late 1969, Biafra was barely breathing. The land that once dreamed of freedom now lay in ruins. Its fields scorched, its roads broken, its towns silent. Everywhere, hunger had become the ruler. Men walked like ghosts. Children no longer ran. And the sound of weeping had become the sound of life itself. The Nigerian forces pressed forward from every direction. General Matola Muhammad led fierce attacks from the north. Colonel Benjamin Adekono, the Black Scorpion, stormed through the south, vowing to crush Biafra completely. His soldiers were ruthless. Villages were burned, civilians were shot, and every inch of captured land was declared liberated. In response, Biafra fought desperately. But the weapons were few, the fighters exhausted. The world had turned away. Foreign journalists were banned from the front lines. And what was left of the airstrips could no longer receive supplies. Even the relief planes at Uli began to fall silent. The end was near, and everyone knew it. Ojukwu still spoke to his people through the radio. His voice, once strong and commanding, now carried the weight of a dying nation. He called for courage. He said, "Even if the last Biafran falls, let the world know we stood for justice." But in the dark corners of his mind, he knew the line between heroism and destruction was fading. The people had suffered enough. The land had given everything. In December 1969, the Nigerian army captured Owerri. Soon after, Umuahia, the temporary capital, fell. The once proud Republic of Biafra had shrunk to a thin stretch of land. The sound of artillery never stopped. Bombs fell even on refugee camps and hospitals. The world saw the horror through grainy black and white footage. But it seemed too far, too complicated, too African. Then came the final blow. The last Biafran defenses collapsed. Ojukwu gathered his closest advisors and made a painful decision. A decision that would break his people's hearts but perhaps save their lives. On the night of January 9, 1970, Ojukwu boarded a small aircraft at Uli airstrip. It was the same runway where 8 planes once brought hope. Now, it was his escape route. He flew to Ivory Coast, where President Felix Houphouët-Boigny granted him asylum. He left behind a land in ashes. In his farewell message, Ojukwu said quietly, "I have fought to preserve the life of my people. I have no regrets, but I must go. For the struggle has reached a point where I can no longer save them." The next day, his second-in-command, Major General Philip F. Young, broadcast a message to the world. "Fellow countrymen, we are firm, we are loyal, and we accept the ceasefire. The Republic of Biafra hereby ceases to exist." And just like that, after 30 months of blood and hunger, the dream of Biafra ended. But the end was not silence. There were no celebrations, no cheers. Only tears, and the sound of empty wind passing through the ruins. 3 million people, mostly civilians, had died from war, famine, and disease. It was one of the worst human disasters of the 20th century. When the Nigerian troops entered the last Biafran territories, they found people too weak to stand. The soldiers offered food, but the survivors were too afraid to eat. Some thought the food was poisoned. They had been hunted for so long that even kindness looked like a trap. General Gowon announced the policy of no victor, no vanquished. He called for unity, for forgiveness. He promised to rebuild, to welcome Biafrans back into Nigeria. But the wounds ran deep. Too deep to heal overnight. Many Biafrans returned to their villages only to find nothing left. Homes were gone. Schools were gone. Whole families had vanished. And for years, the survivors carried their pain in silence. Their stories whispered in corners. Their memories hidden like scars that never fade. The war ended on paper. But inside hearts, it continued. For some, the name Biafra became a forbidden word. A memory too dangerous to speak aloud. For others, it became a symbol of dignity. A reminder of what it means to be forgotten by the world. And still refuse to disappear. And so, the first chapter of this story closed. But history does not end with surrender. The real battle, the struggle to remember, to rebuild, to understand what was lost, was only beginning. The second chapter begins. The guns had fallen silent. But silence did not mean peace. It was January 1970, and the land that once called itself Biafra was a graveyard of dreams. The sun rose over empty towns, and the smell of smoke and decay still hung in the air. The war was over, but the suffering was not. Across the east, millions of people emerged from the forest and refugee camps. Thin, hollow, and afraid. They returned to homes that no longer existed. They searched for family members who never came back. They dug through the ruins, finding only bones and memories. The Nigerian soldiers who now occupied the land spoke the words of peace, no victor, no vanquished. But in the eyes of the survivors, those words sounded far away, like a song sung in another language. There was no food, no medicine, no work. The currency of Biafra was worthless. People were given only 20 Nigerian pounds, no matter how much they had owned before the war. Entire life savings were erased with the stroke of a pen. It was meant to rebuild the economy. But for many, it felt like punishment. Churches tried to fill the void. They reopened their doors, turning altars into feeding centers. Missionaries distributed food, and priests buried the unburied. The war had taken so much that even faith trembled under its weight. And yet, life began again. Children returned to school under mango trees. Farmers began to till the soil, their hands still shaking from memories of gunfire. Women rebuilt their homes from mud and bamboo. singing old songs to remind themselves that they were still alive. In Lagos, General Yakubu Gowon faced a new challenge: how to reunite a country that had torn itself apart. He spoke of reconciliation, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. He believed that forgiveness would heal Nigeria. But forgiveness cannot be ordered. It must be grown, and that takes time. In the North, many saw the end of the war as a victory for unity. In the East, it felt more like survival. The scars were not just physical, they were emotional, generational. Every family carried a story of loss. A father who never returned. A child who died of hunger. A dream buried with a flag. But Nigerians are a people who do not stay broken for long. Markets reopened. Trade routes revived. Cities like Onitsha, Aba, and Enugu began to hum again with life. The Igbo spirit of enterprise rose from the ashes. Quietly, steadily, almost defiantly. They built, they traded, they educated their children. They refused to be erased. The same resilience that kept Biafra alive during the blockade now fueled their survival in peace. Still, the past lingered. Unspoken, but never forgotten. Parents told their children only fragments of what happened. Schools avoided the topic. The word Biafra became something whispered, as if saying it too loudly might reopen the wounds. But memories have a way of surviving, even when silence tries to bury them. They lived in lullabies, in scars, in the eyes of the old men who still gazed at the sunrise, and remembered another flag, one with half a yellow sun. The world moved on, but the land remembered. And deep within the memory of that land, something restless continued to breathe. A question. An ache. A name that refused to die. The 1970s brought peace. But it was a peace of silence. Nigeria wanted to forget the war, quickly, completely, entirely. The wounds were still open, but the country wrapped them in silence. And called it healing. In schools, the war was barely mentioned. History books spoke of the Civil War, but not of the hunger, the bombings, the children who starved. It was as if the suffering of millions had been erased by a single phrase. No victor, no vanquished. 4 words meant to unite a nation, but also words that buried the truth. In the East, families rebuilt their lives quietly. They were told to move on, to forgive and forget. But how do you forget the faces of the dead? How do you erase the image of a starving child? The Igbo people focused on survival. They rebuilt their businesses, reopened their markets, and sent their children to school again. Education became their rebellion, a weapon stronger than guns. If they could not win the war, they would win the future. Meanwhile, the Nigerian government celebrated unity. Oil was discovered in the Niger Delta, and soon the black gold flowed, bringing wealth, but also corruption. New skyscrapers rose in Lagos, but the roads in the east stayed broken. The wounds of war had not healed. They had simply been covered with new paint. Those who had lived through the horror kept their memories locked inside. Mothers rarely spoke of the children they lost. Fathers never mentioned the battles they fought. At night, the silence was louder than gunfire. It was a silence of survival. A silence born of fear that telling the truth might bring punishment. In churches and markets, whispers remained. Stories were passed like secret prayers. They came through our village. One old woman would say, "They burned everything, but we hid in the forest." Another would add, "My brother died in the air raids. He was only 12. The stories continued, but always behind closed doors. The world, too, had moved on. Television screens now showed new wars, new disasters. Biafra became just another tragedy in the archives of history. Yet for those who had seen it, the images never faded. The thin arms, the swollen bellies, the endless sky filled with hunger. In the late 1970s and 1980s, A new generation was born. Children who had not seen the war but lived in its shadow. They grew up hearing fragments. During the war, we suffered. During the war, we hid. During the war, we lost everything. But the details were always missing. As if the truth was too heavy to hand down. This silence shaped a generation. They grew up proud to be Nigerian, but uncertain of who they really were. They saw their parents' pain, but could not name it. The war became a ghost. Invisible, but everywhere. Then came the artists. The writers, the musicians. Voices who refused to let the memory die. In songs and novels. Biafra returned, not as a rebellion, but as a story that demanded to be told. They began to paint the past in color. To speak the names that history had erased. Because memory, once buried, does not stay dead. It waits. It waits in the quiet. Until someone dares to speak again. By the 1990s, the silence began to break. A new generation was asking questions. Questions their parents had been too afraid to answer. What really happened during the war? Why do we not learn it in school? Why do people still call us Biafrans? In markets and bus stops, whispers turned into conversations. In universities, young students searched dusty archives for truth. They found faded photographs, children with hollow eyes. Letters written by soldiers. And stories that spoke of unimaginable suffering. What they discovered was not just history. It was pain, frozen in time. In the streets of Enugu, Aba, and Onitsha, murals began to appear. Paintings of broken maps. Faces crying out from the past. Artists used their brushes like weapons, bringing back the war that had been erased. They called it Remembering the Forgotten. Across Nigeria, the nation was changing. Military rule had ended, and democracy returned. But even in freedom, the old divisions remained beneath the surface. Politics still carried the echoes of the past. North versus South. Christian versus Muslim. Memory versus denial. The children of those who fought the war were now leaders, teachers, and soldiers themselves. Some carried bitterness, others carried hope. Many simply wanted peace. A peace built on truth, not silence. Then came the early 2000s. And with them, the rise of new voices. Movements began to appear, calling for justice, recognition, or even independence once more. They spoke of marginalization, of forgotten promises, of a region still waiting for fairness. The old name, Biafra, returned, not as a country, but as an idea. For some, it meant pain. For others, pride. For the youth, it became a symbol. A reminder that identity, once denied, always finds a way back. On social media, images of the war resurfaced, shared by those who had never lived it. Videos, songs, and documentaries brought the ghost of the past to the digital age. Biafra was no longer a forbidden word. It had become a conversation. But conversations can divide as much as they heal. Old wounds reopened. Some saw this new movement as a threat to unity. Others as a cry for justice. And so the debate continued. What does it mean to be Nigerian? What does it mean to be Biafran? Can both truths live in the same heart? In literature, voices like Chinua Achebe, Chimamanda Adichie, and many others gave the war a language of humanity. Achebe's There Was a Country told of sorrow and betrayal. Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun gave it emotion and color. Through these stories, the world began to see what history had hidden. They learned that the war was not just about politics or power. It was about people. Ordinary people caught between dreams and death. As the years passed, the memory of Biafra stopped being a whisper. It became a song, sad, powerful, unending. A song that said, "We remember. We forgive. But we cannot forget." Today, The war is more than history. It is a mirror, reflecting who Nigeria was. And who it still struggles to become. A nation of many voices. Still learning to sing the same song without fear. Because remembering Biafra is not about reopening wounds. It is about learning. Learning how fragile peace can be. How dangerous division is. And how powerful truth remains. The Nigerian Civil War ended more than half a century ago. But its echoes still move through the nation like wind through tall grass. Time has softened the memories. But not the meaning. For every family that lost a father, a child, a home, the war never truly ended. Across the villages of the southeast, there are graves without names. Monuments made not of stone but of silence. Children play on the same soil where their ancestors once starved. They do not know the stories, but they feel them. In the way their mothers pause when the word Biafra is spoken. In the way old men stare quietly at the horizon when they hear the sound of airplanes. The war took more than lives. It took innocence. It taught Nigeria what hate could do, and what silence could destroy. It showed the world that even the proudest nations can bleed from within, if they forget to listen to their own people. Yet from that suffering came resilience. A kind of strength born not from victory, but from survival. The Igbo rebuilt with their hands and their hope. They built schools, markets, churches, turning ashes into foundations. Their story became a testament to the human spirit, that even in ruin, there is renewal. For Africa, Biafra remains a warning. A warning about the dangers of division, of leaders who trade humanity for power, and of nations that deny their diversity instead of embracing it. It reminds the continent that unity cannot be forced. It must be built, brick by brick, truth by truth. And for the world, Biafra exposed the failure of silence. When the famine raged and children died, the world looked away for too long. The images of starving children eventually reached global screens. And conscience awakened, but too late. It was then that the word humanitarian crisis became real. And the modern idea of aid and relief began to take shape. From the ashes of Biafra grew the foundations of modern humanitarian organizations. Groups like Medicine Sans Frontieres, born from doctors who refused to remain quiet while millions suffered. So the war, in its tragedy, changed not just Nigeria, but the world's moral compass. It taught humanity that neutrality in the face of injustice is also a choice. A dangerous one. As Nigeria continues its journey, the ghost of Biafra whispers lessons for the living. Never let ethnicity outweigh empathy. Never let ambition drown humanity. And never let history be rewritten in silence. Today, when Nigerians sing the national anthem, though tribe and tongue may differ, in brotherhood we stand. It is both a promise and a reminder. A promise of unity yet to be fulfilled, and a reminder of what happens when unity fails. The children of those who fought now tell their own stories. Some through films, others through songs or classrooms. They speak not of revenge, but of remembrance. Because remembrance is how nations heal. Not by forgetting, but by facing the past with honesty and grace. In the end, Biafra was not just a place. It was an idea. The dream of dignity. The cry for justice. The longing to be seen. And though that dream burned in war, its ashes became seeds of strength. Perhaps that is the legacy of Biafra. Not the map that disappeared, but the spirit that endured. A spirit that still says, "We are here. We remember. We will rise again."